You'll get that later. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. On March 14th, 2014, Dr. Jim McGrogan and his friends set off on a guy's trip for a hike up in Vail, Colorado. After splitting up from the group that he was with at 10 a.m., Jim would disappear, never to be seen alive again. Today, we're going to tell you the story of how that happened. To start off, it's important to note that Jim McGrogan was a medical doctor. He was 39 years old, he was in fantastic physical shape, and he had the medical training and outdoorsman experience to be going on a hike with really no trouble whatsoever. Now, to be clear, the hike that Jim and his friends were undertaking was by no means an easy, casual one, but it also wasn't the sort of ice climbing that you might see with Mount Everest or Denali or something like that. This was just a hike up a rather difficult trail, but at the same time, it's not the kind of trail that people usually go missing or die on. Jim and his friends were going for a hike in Vail, Colorado. Now, Vail is one of the most popular skiing destinations in the country. Importantly, though, in the context of this being a missing 411 case, Vail is located within White River National Forest. So, off the bat, we're talking about something that very much fits in with the national parks conspiracy that we talk about all the time on this channel. Vail sits at about 8,150 feet in elevation, and it is in the state, Colorado, with the most avalanche fatalities per year of any state in the country. However, that doesn't stop most people, especially because these avalanches tend to happen on back trails and not on the main areas in which people use Vail slopes. The group was hiking to Eisenman Hut, which sits at about 11,230 feet of elevation, so there's about 3,000 feet of elevation change involved in this hike. And while Eisenman Hut itself is only about 4 miles from the town of Vail, the trail to get there is a 9-mile trek, again, up 3,000 feet of elevation, so it is a difficult path. There are 2 different ways to get to Eisenman Hut, but it's not clear exactly which trail they started off on that day. It is, of course, important to note that there are 2 trails to get up to Eisenman Hut, but which one they took is unclear. Jim and his friends set off for Eisenman Hut at 8:30 a.m. on March 14th, 2014. The weather that day was pretty mild for a winter day in Vail, at least at the time that they started out. It was 30 degrees Fahrenheit with some cloud cover and a gentle 6-mile-an-hour easterly breeze. So, really not the kind of day where you would anticipate bad things to happen. It would, of course, begin to snow later on, but for the first hour and a half of the hike, when Jim and his friends were all still together, there really weren't any issues. Nobody was concerned about anything. Nobody was looking around going, this is worrisome, maybe we should go back down. It wasn't the kind of case where you were worried about natural disasters occurring. And the first hour and a half of their hike went off without a hitch. They covered about 4 miles of the trip, and at 10 a.m. decided that they all wanted to sit down and take a little bit of a break, enjoy the scenery, and not really worry about getting there. They were making great time. Of course, 4 miles in an hour and a half is pretty standard for just somebody walking. But to be going uphill implies that these were all men who were in pretty good shape. At 10 a.m., which was the time of separation, it was a little bit colder, 27 degrees, and had begun snowing rather heavily, yet it still hadn't accumulated on the ground. Dr. McGrogan's friends would later say that they were a bit irritated with him for wanting to go on ahead without them when they decided to stop for a rest, but they figured that eventually they would catch up to him and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. So, at 10 a.m., Jim packed up all of his stuff, hit the trail, and started heading up toward Eisenman Peak. After convincing everybody that it wasn't that big a deal and he would be just fine on his own, after all, he had a GPS, a cell phone, an avalanche beacon, warm clothes, food, water, a first aid kit, and a few other necessary supplies for survival. And Jim was known within his group for being a pretty avid and strong outdoorsman. They really weren't worried, it was more that they were just annoyed that he was going on without them. So, he set off, and they figured it wouldn't be a big deal. Now, when he set off, if you had looked up the trail after him, what you would have seen was that the trail itself, while it was snowing, was heavily compacted snow. This was a well-walked trail. It was not the kind of thing where people were blazing their way along. Both sides of the trail had at least 3 feet of soft snow on them. So any attempt to leave the trail would result in a pretty clear set of tracks being left behind. And even in the heavy snow that is common for Vail, it would take several hours for enough snow to accumulate that it would cover up any tracks. Now, snow would continue accumulating until it stopped snowing at 9:30 p.m., but by then, the search had already been launched. because what happened here is that Jim's friends made it to the rest stop where they expected to see Jim, but he wasn't there. So, of course, figuring he had just gone along all the way up to the hut at the top of the mountain, they just continued, figuring they'd run into him there. But when they arrived there late in the afternoon and spent a little while searching the hut and the surrounding area for their friend, it occurred to them that something was wrong. Jim was not where he was expected to be, and so they contacted the authorities, which in this case were the Eagle County Sheriff's Department, who called in help from a local National Guard station. So a search was launched with 110 people, covering an 18 square mile search area with multiple helicopters, dog teams, and snowmobiles. Now, of course, at the time, nobody was too concerned. Jim was perfectly capable of surviving in 30-degree weather alone for a few hours, and again, they figured that if something had gone wrong, he would have let somebody know. After all, he had his avalanche beacon, which is a two-way transponder that allows people to locate people buried in an avalanche. And he had his GPS and a fully charged cell phone, and it's believed he had at least several spare batteries or pre-charged portable chargers. So, if he needed help, he could call for it. This area does have cell service. On top of all of the preparedness, it's important to remember that Jim himself was a medical doctor. He was a physician. So they figured even if he did manage to hurt himself, he could probably stitch up and fix just about any minor wound, and any major wound, he could reach out for help. So the search was a little bit leisurely at first, not unconcerned and not lazy, but it wasn't the kind of thing where people figured it was life and death. That's not to say that nobody was worried, but he simply was expected to be okay. The search, of course, began in its immediacy around the trail. So they made sure to send people up and down, look for any tracks that indicated somebody had departed, but in that first few hours, nobody found anything. It did not appear that there were tracks leading off of the trail, and considering the time difference, it had only been at most 11 and a half hours. And even if it were 10 a.m. that he completely disappeared, if he had walked off the trail immediately after leaving his friends, they would have seen his tracks. And those tracks still would have been there. There weren't 3 feet of snowfall that day. Now, we don't have exact numbers for accumulation of snow, but it's pretty safe to say that had Jim walked off the path, somebody would have seen his footprints. As March 15th dawned and the search widened to cover other areas not previously searched, there was a little bit more concern. Where was Jim? Why were there no footprints? How did he go missing? Did he reach Eisman Peak and then decide to go down the hill somewhere else? Nobody really knew how this could have possibly gone wrong, but they continued to search, and this time they began to rely more on the helicopters and the snowmobiles. The dogs had failed to pick up a scent. From March 15th, 16th, and 17th through some of the 18th, the weather remained steady. It was a little bit of snow, but for the most part, it was clear or somewhat cloudy skies and sun. It did not at any point get warm enough to melt snow, and it doesn't seem that snow accumulated that much before the 18th. But on the 18th, it got rough. The authorities were forced to suspend the search effort on March 18th because the weather got so bad, to the point where nearly 8 feet of snow were on the ground in certain portions of the search area. Having heard absolutely nothing from McGrogan and knowing that he had the tools to call out if he was alive and in need of help, he was presumed dead, but not officially confirmed as such. And he would maintain that status of being assumedly dead for 20 days until on April 3rd, a few backcountry hikers and skiers discovered Jim's body laying in an ice fall under Booth's Falls. However, he wasn't under Booth's Falls. He was several hundred yards away, just laying there. It didn't appear that he had fallen into any sort of running water because all of it was frozen, and his body would not have slid that far had he fallen over the falls, which is why it was so confusing and confounding that Jim had a head injury, a broken femur, and broken ribs along with internal injuries that all indicated that he had fallen from a great height. So, when he was found, dead, of course, his body displayed characteristics of somebody who had experienced a freefall. Get it? McGrogan's body didn't just display very strange and inexplicable injuries, it also was missing his boots, his coat, and his gloves. And yet, he had head trauma while still wearing his snowboarding helmet. So, in order for him to have sustained that, either the helmet must not have been on when he actually sustained the trauma, or it must have been such an incredibly hard impact that it just didn't stop at the helmet. But the helmet, from what I can tell in my research, did not display any sort of signs of being involved in a fall like that. So the only conclusion, unless this is some missing information from the case, is that Jim was not wearing his helmet when he sustained the head injury. So why was he wearing his helmet when he was found? Did he sustain the head injury and put it back on? Did somebody hit him in the head and then put his helmet back on simply to move him to a place where they dumped the body? It doesn't make any sense. There's also no tracks that were leading up to him, and during the initial search, the area in which his body had been found, Booth's Falls, 4.5 miles away as the crow flies, was actually already searched. So, on March 18th, Jim McGrogan's body was not there, which implies that Jim was still alive somewhere on this mountain when the search ended, and then eventually made his way to Booth's Falls. Or, possibly, he was not alive and was eventually moved to Booth's Falls. We don't know. Furthermore, his snowboard was found nearby his body, but without his boots, he couldn't have possibly used it. And this was also a split snowboard, meaning that it was split lengthwise and could be put into two pieces to be carried more easily. His backpack was found with his body as well, and it contained all of his supplies, his food, his water, his spare clothes, and his phone, which hadn't been used to call for help. And there's no reason to believe that his phone was not working when he initially went missing over the course of those first few days. His GPS also was working, and his avalanche beacon was in good shape. There is no reason that if Jim needed help, he could not have called for it. Phone records also showed that he placed no calls and sent no texts during the period between him going missing and his body being found. There are even more issues with the location of Jim's body and the circumstances of his disappearance. For example, just like with the Aaron Hedges case that we talked about in one of our other videos, at every point along this trail, along his time on this mountain, he would have been able to see safety. If Jim had simply looked down the mountain, he would have seen the town of Vail just 4 or 5 miles away. And while it would have been more complicated to hike there because there wasn't a trail, he still could have gotten there, or at least tried to flag somebody down for help. He didn't. In addition to the part where he could have seen the town of Vail, he also would have had to hike 12 to 14 miles to get where he was. There was no straight 4-mile shot from where Jim went missing to where Jim was found. And along the way, there were portions where there were up to 8 feet of snow, and yet no tracks were seen. From the sky, from a helicopter, if you're flying around looking for somebody who's missing, you can see pretty well if they have left a trail. We can, fly planes above the Amazon and see lines that denote where there used to be buildings. It's incredible what you can actually see from the sky, and yet trained search and rescue, Army National Guard pilots could not find any trace of Jim making a trail down the mountain. It was forested, but at the same time, there were sections between where he went missing and where he was found that are not forested enough to obscure a trail from the sky. And finally, why didn't Jim call for help? That is probably the most important question here. Because in order for him to go missing without calling for help, he must have been either unconscious or delirious at the point when he left the trail. But again, there's no sign that he ever left the trail. So, the only possibilities here are that he was kidnapped and brought somewhere else, or that he somehow made it off of the trail, presumably once he got to the top, and then just headed down the mountain somewhere else, into the more wild terrain where there wouldn't have been an easy spot to look for where he left. Because again, with the trail, it was compacted snow, 9 miles of this uphill with 3 to 5 feet of snow on either side. If he had left the trail while on the trail and not at the top, it would have been visible to search and rescue, and it wasn't, which means that he can't have left the trail unless he was at the top of it. And since we know he didn't come back down, that's the only real explanation here. Unless you're going into something supernatural, like a bird snatched him off of the trail or something like that. And that seems pretty unrealistic. The only possibilities here for how somebody could get off that trail are if they went all the way to the top and then left from somewhere around Eisenman Cabin, or if they were picked up by something that could fly or swing through the trees. Those are the only possible options here. And even if we are okay with believing that Jim walked all the way up this trail, got to the top, got to the end, and then somehow lost his mind, it still doesn't account for how he walked 12 to 14 miles all the way to Booth's Falls without leaving a trail, without being seen, and without dying in the 8 feet of snow that would have surrounded him in some parts of this trip. And then, how did he sustain the fall injuries when his body was not located anywhere near any sort of cliff or high place? He just can't have died from a fall where he was found. So that means that his body has to have been put there at some point. None of the details of the case actually make sense altogether. If you take individual stuff, sure, he's got fall injuries. You can theorize that he fell, but there's no cliff. There's nowhere he could have fallen from. There was no avalanche reported. There was nothing reported of him being in a tree. There is no reason to believe that he fell onto that spot, which implies, of course, that his body was placed there after death. And the reason that it must have been placed there after death is because Jim could not possibly have gotten to where he did with a broken femur. There's just no way. It's impossible. When it comes to investigating possible foul play, none was really suspected. Nobody that Jim left on the trip with had any motive, any reason to hurt him unless they were that upset that he decided to go alone. But that would require everybody keeping quiet about committing a murder of one of their friends entirely because he decided he wanted to keep hiking when they wanted to take a rest. That's not a good enough motive for murder. It doesn't make any sense. And nobody at Eisenman Cabin reported seeing Jim McGrogan that day. So either somebody did a damn good job of kidnapping him, covering up all of the tracks, and taking his body 4.5 miles away, assuming they flew it there, 12 to 14 if by foot, and then not having anybody notice for 20 days? It just doesn't make any sense. As for the specific missing 411 profile points that this touches on, it actually gets a pretty good number of them. It gets 7 of them. This is a national forest. There was a steep elevation change. His body was actually found at 9,600 feet when he had left from about 8,100 and should have reached 11.2. There was a dramatic, if not sudden, weather change. Booth's Falls is part of Booth's Creek, which is, of course, full of boulders. This is, of course, in Colorado, in the Rocky Mountains. There are lots of cave systems. The dogs could not pick up a scent, and when he was found, he was missing clothing, his boots, gloves, and coat. So, what are some possible explanations? Well, the normal stuff doesn't really fit because there were no tracks. So if somebody kidnapped him, then how'd they get him off the trail without anybody noticing, and how was he not found? Why was his body located somewhere that had already been searched, and why 20 days later? Was Jim hidden for some of that time, and then once they hadn't found him, his body was placed out in the open? That doesn't really make sense. There's no motive to do that. Even if this were a human serial killer, there's really no reason for them to leave his body out in the open after he'd already gotten away with the crime, or she. Unless it was somebody who wanted the notoriety for killing him, but also didn't leave any evidence that they had killed him. So it just doesn't fit with serial killers, like, types and characteristics. There's really no human explanation for this, and that leaves wild animals. Well, the area isn't really known for being home to grizzlies or anything that would hunt human beings, and on top of that, there would have been a blood trail if he was just snagged off of the trail and dragged away somewhere else. It wouldn't have all gotten covered up, and it probably would have been even more obvious than if a human had taken him. So, when you get down to brass tacks, there's really no natural, normal explanation for what happened to Jim McGrogan. All you have is the supernatural, and even then, the question becomes, what sort of supernatural folk legend could even do that to somebody? And at the end of the day, there's really only one that fits when you look at the region, the weather conditions, and the state in which his body was found. And that, unfortunately, is the Wendigo. But that doesn't make a ton of sense in and of itself because he was found. Usually with Wendigo folklore, you're not looking at something that leaves bits and pieces lying around. You're looking at something that drags somebody into a cave or a mine shaft and devours them there, And, the bones don't usually get left out in the open randomly. So even when looking into supernatural explanations for what could have happened to Jim McGrogan, if anything, there is no explanation. That leaves exactly one thing in my mind, which is something that we've talked about on this channel before as well, which is dimensional rifts. Maybe if that's a thing, if that's a real phenomenon, that's something that exists out there, it's the only one that really makes any sense. Perhaps Jim, found his way to slip into a parallel dimension for a second and ended up coming out in the sky? I don't have an answer. I don't know. So I'm curious what all of you think. Was Jim kidnapped? Was Jim attacked by something supernatural? Did he slip through into a parallel universe for a second and then slip back at a very unopportune time? Let us know in the comments, and if you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, make sure to check us out on Patreon. We have tiers from $1 to $100. Any amount helps, but if you can't monetarily contribute or you don't really feel like it, at the very least, smash the like button, hit the notification bell, subscribe to the channel, and if you're feeling like it, share us with your friends. We'd really appreciate it. It would mean the world to us. And you can, of course, check us out on our other socials. I am at the Aiden Mattis on just about everything. Our director and editor over here, Aiden Thornbury, is at Director Aiden on also just about everything. He just waved. Say hi.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, see, there we go. So you can follow us there as well. And without further ado, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.